We have some special guests with us, and I'll introduce them in a few moments. For those of you who are new to BioLogos, we are an organization founded by Dr. Francis Collins, who is now the director of the National Institutes of Health, and he led the Human Genome Project. We have many scientists of outstanding reputation in our network, and we are committed to biblical faith. Our mission is to invite the church and the world to see the harmony that exists between science and biblical faith. But it's difficult to hear harmony in our culture today. The voices are loud, and there's important and challenging issues being raised. So we have to, in these moments of disharmony, to dwell on these clashes a bit and understand them better. The topics that BioLogos usually talks about can get people's emotions stirred up. We've addressed evolution, we've addressed climate change, and then you add race to that, it's even more challenging. But we are committed to humble dialogue. We value the opportunity for voices to listen to one another, to hear new ideas we haven't heard before, and to realize we might be wrong and that we have things to learn. We are about seeking the truth. So tonight we have a chance to hear how these truths look from some of the valued African American members of our community. So we hope to shortly have on Bishop Claude Alexander, one of our board members, but we're having some technical difficulties with him, but hopefully those will be resolved. I'll go ahead and introduce our two other panelists as well. We have Reverend Harvey Clemens Jr. Hello, Harvey.
It's good to see you. How you doing, Deb? Good seeing you as well. Thank you for letting me be part of this.
Indeed. So Reverend Harvey has been at the helm of Pleasant Hill Baptist Church in Houston, Texas since 1983, and he's a native of Houston, reared in the 5th Ward. And he's received numerous awards, honors, and recognitions for his work in ministry and neighborhood revitalization. He's also been a mentor and advisor to many organizations, and he has served on the BioLogos Advisory Council for these last few years. I had the privilege of preaching in Harvey's church a few years ago, and it was a wonderful experience. And we also have with us Dr. Lynette Strickland. Hello, Lynette.
Hi, thank you for having me here. It's a privilege.
Yes, and that doctor must sound really good to you because she just earned her PhD. She completed her PhD at the University of Illinois in biology, studying beetles in Panama. Some of you might know her voice because she was on a BioLogos podcast last year. She's now doing a postdoc at Texas A&M, and so we're glad to have you with us. So, great. All right, we hope to have Claude join us at any point, but how about we start the conversation by just hearing a little bit about how this moment looks to you both. For me as a white person, it feels different than some of the past incidences of shootings, just the global outcry. For the first time, I'm seeing major science organizations saying, okay, let's stop doing research for a day just to read about racial issues. I don't recall that ever happening. How does this look to you? What have your experiences been the last few weeks, and how are you reading the moment? How about I go to you first, Harvey?
Well, it's interesting because the diversity, how comprehensive the movement seemed to be in terms of the variety of personalities that are involved. People from different social, economic levels, all ethnicities, cultures. And not just the United States. We even have people who are part of this movement on other continents. It reminds me in many ways that movement that took place when apartheid fell. And at the end of apartheid, as long as it was South Africa and South Africa alone, it seemed as though that they could not get any traction. But once it became a global movement, then Nelson was released from prison after being there for 28 years. The clerk resigned, and you saw a whole new movement. One cannot really say what the result of this effort will be, but it certainly does seem to be more comprehensive than it has been before, even more comprehensive than the civil rights movement.
Yeah. Wow. That is a really interesting parallel to the end of apartheid. I pray it may be so. That gives me hope, actually, that we might actually make a difference this time in a way that hasn't been before. I understand that Bishop Claude's technology is ready, so we're going to bring him on screen here. Yes, we can hear you.
Claude.
Hey,
hey,
how
buddy.
you doing? All right.
Oh, hallelujah! Our prayers are answered.
I thought you had left me stuck out, man.
Oh no, I will never leave you comfortless.
Well, let me introduce you at least briefly, and then I'm going to hand it off to you. So this is Bishop Claude Alexander. He is the senior pastor of the Park Church in Charlotte, North Carolina. And for the last several years, he's been a member of the board of BioLogos, of the board of directors. He's also on the board of Gordon Conwell Seminary and several other leading evangelical organizations. It's just been a privilege to have his wisdom as part of our organization. So we're happy to have you here, and we've asked Claude to set the agenda for today's conversation, and I've tried to get us started, so you can take it from here.
Well, it's great to be with you. We had to break up this Texas contingency. We need some. We needed to break that up a little bit. But it's a real delight to be with you today. And Deb, I must commend you and the board of BioLogos for leaning in to this discussion, because there is a place for science to address this matter. The intractability of race is in part due to the fact that there's never been an America where there hasn't been race.
Yeah.
For as long as America has been America, there has been race. In fact, 157 years before America was America, race was in the English colonies, and race served as the amniotic fluid, a scientific word, into which America was born.
Yeah. Oh no. Okay. Appears that our technological problems are not solved yet. I really want to give Bishop Claude a moment to finish his thought, but perhaps we'll come back to that. Maybe, Lynette, if I could turn to you and get your perspective as a person of your generation, especially, and your experience as a scientist. What are you seeing in this moment?
Sure, absolutely. It does. There is something about this time and this movement that does feel different than things that have happened before. I think there are conversations happening in all sorts of areas that have never addressed these issues. I know the lab where I did my PhD, for the first time, we had a discussion on why Black Lives Matter in science and why academia is not immune to racial inequality, and how academia has sometimes perpetrated racial inequality. And so the fact that all of these sorts of conversations are really starting to happen and people are fully waking up to the fact that we need to address this. We can't hope that it will disappear on its own. It has to be very intentional. I think for me is hopeful. Yeah.
Yeah, indeed. Can I ask, like, how many other African Americans were there in your PhD program at your university? It was. I mean, I'm guessing it was pretty small.
Right. So when I started, there were about 3 of us. We all knew each other. We tried to build a support system for one another. Multiple people actually ended up leaving the department for various reasons. We all had just sort of a much harder time trying to assimilate sort of to academic culture. And I think when I finished, 2 other Black students had joined our sort of wider department, but then I left, so that brought the number again to 2. So it's a problem, right? There really is a lack of diversity and a lack of inclusion in academic departments that needs to be addressed.
Yeah. I had a different flavor of that as being a woman in physics. There was a time where there were 3 women out of 50 men in our physics department at MIT among the graduate students. And so it's getting the numbers a little bit higher so there can actually be a larger community and culture, and so you're not the only one in the room all the time. So I really feel for you, knowing, when it's just 2 or 3, and yet I'm sure the issues are differently as well. Yeah. Yeah. Any further thoughts on that?
I mean, just sort of like you said, until we reach this point where it is normal to be Black in academia, it will continue to be abnormal. And so any Black student who enters an academic classroom or an academic lab or an academic office will always feel like they're out of place. And that is often what results in those students leaving academia and leaving science and pursuing other avenues. And we're not going to increase the number of Black students and students of color in academia until we can see ourselves there, until we see tenure track professors who are Black, until we see research associates who are Black and deans who are Black. So, it really does take strengthening this pipeline and allowing students to make it further.
That is so true. It's being able to see those roles filled by people of your group. It makes such a difference.
It does.
Let me go back to Harvey a moment. I wanted to ask you also about, you're right there in Houston, and George Floyd's funeral was there, I believe. Can you tell us a little bit of what it was like there on the ground in response to that?
Well, it was, again, another one of those things. I actually marched in the protests from the center of downtown to City Hall, along with the mayor and some of Mr. Floyd's family members. If you saw it on the news, it was upwards of 60,000 individuals. And I, as we were marching, even though the sadness of the moment that brought those people together was exciting, because you saw people of every hue in that march. I will make another comparison, if you will. When we went to the inauguration of President Barack Obama, and to be in Washington, D.C. at the inauguration of his first election, that was an America that people had aspired for a moment. People were of all colors, all economic backgrounds, and there was a joy, there was a sense of jubilation and celebration that we thought that our community, our country had crossed the line. We had made the move, only to come back 8, 9, 10, 12 years later and find ourselves in this current predicament. Which it says to me is that every generation will have to fight the struggle for justice and equal rights. You never win it for a permanent, sustained effort. It's something that must be fought for, must be maintained, and a constant vigil to make it happen.
Yeah. We don't want to let this die. It's going to need some sustaining thing to carry it on and have it make that long-term impact. I understand that we're going to try one more time here with Bishop Claude and bring him back on.
One more time.
One more time.
Yeah.
And I hope you, and if this doesn't work, we will bring you on some other time. We'll
No
make sure
worries.
it works. So,
no worries.
okay.
I'm good.
Have you been able to hear our conversation a little bit?
I've heard all of it. I've heard all of it,
Awesome.
and I want to give you the opportunity to reflect upon your experiences and how the matter of race has affected you and the work that you do, both in the university and at BioLogos.
Yeah, well, I just feel like I'm in such a track of learning on this. I would say 10, 15 years ago, I really was not aware of white privilege, and I am still learning how much I have benefited from things. It's been a pleasure to get to know the three of you and many others that we're drawing into our network. That has really been a blessing for us, and it's enriched us so much. So I'm hearing some kitchen noises and things going on in the background there. I don't know where that is from. But, yeah, what else is this to us? I think for us in the science and faith conversation, it has been a very white and I'll also say very male conversation historically. And it really needs other voices, especially for questions of what does it mean to be made in the image of God? How does that relate to science? What does it mean to be human? And all those times science has been misused or used rightly to help us understand that question. And if we don't have voices from a variety of experiences, we are not going to be able to make progress on that. So that's been one of the big things for me. One of the things I'm hoping for going forward.
Sure. So this is for Harvey and Lynette. When we look at the disparities in terms of health, part of that goes to the historical skepticism and suspicion that African Americans and other people of color have had with reference to science. Can you speak to how that has been in your fields and the ways in which you're seeking to address that?
Lynette, would you like to go first?
Sure, absolutely. In my field, this has been incredibly prominent. There are so many very well-known examples of how Black people have been mistreated and experimented on at the hands of white scientists and white physicians for centuries. Probably one of the most well-known examples is Henrietta Lacks, whose cervical cancer cells created the first immortalized cell line, and this was done without her permission or consent. And these cell lines are still used today in some instances and have. So I think the mistrust that communities of color and Black communities have in science and in medicine is very much founded on truth. There have been many instances where our communities could not trust the white scientists and the white physicians around them. So I think addressing that moving forward is going to be difficult, and it's going to rely on including Black scientists and Black physicians.
You know, I agree with you, Lynette. In preparation for another presentation we were doing for Elaine Upland in her conference, why do we need religion and science together? And I was talking to one of our members who is on the scientist track, and she pointed out that, Pastor, we have been the experiment, not the person who are conducting the experiment. And when you look at places like Tuskegee and the studies that was carried on there, and you see the effects that and how people were mutilated, just as racism is passed on from one generation to the next, fears and anxieties are passed on from one generation to the next. You can have Black grandmothers and great grandmothers tell their young children, don't go down there and let them people use you as a guinea pig. And so we have people who are dying sometimes needlessly because of fears and anxieties and misinformation. And by the way, that's also one of the reasons why we need to have people of color being in the scientific community.
Mm-hmm.
So Lynette, part of what people say in education is this notion of self-efficacy. And part of self-efficacy is being able to see people who look like you doing certain things for you to believe that it's possible for you to do them. So who was that for you that would cause you to want to enter into your field?
That's a great question. So honestly, for me, I never had a person of color who was a scientist around me. I had one research professor who was a white male, and he was very invested in helping me get into research, and he did help me. And it wasn't actually until I started teaching at the university where I did my PhD, and most of the classes I taught, I was very intentional about. So 75 to 90% of my students were Black and Hispanic, and they would so often send me emails to ask to meet up to discuss this or to talk about career goals. And it took at least half a year before I sat down and finally realized, wow, how would I have felt if at any point in my undergraduate career I had ever had a Black teacher? And from then on, I doubled my investment in those students. And I did everything I could to help them succeed, because unfortunately, we don't all have that. We don't all have someone that we can look at and see ourselves doing what we hope or want to be doing.
Yeah. Bishop, may I add something to that?
Sure, absolutely.
Yeah, I think it started even before we started doing our graduate and postgraduate work. If it is true that the young lives are formed from 0 to 6, I think it is vitally important that we begin in underserved communities working with our young babies at, pre-K and kindergarten, teaching them, the STEM courses that early, and not take the short range look, but look at it, where will we be 20 years from now? Where will we be 25 years from now? If we do not begin to change the lives from 0 to 6, we'll be in the same place where we are now.
So true.
Absolutely. So Lynette, what you also brought up is the importance of the white instructor to see possibility in you and inspire you.
Absolutely.
And to serve as a sponsor. That's important in almost every area. And so Deb, when you think about BioLogos as an organization, how are ways in which that sponsoring happens and can happen more?
Yeah, well, one thing we are doing is we're doing more profiles of scientists of color, African American and Hispanic and Asian. And we were just talking about, wow, we could feature those more prominently on our website, make sure nobody misses them, because we do want to get those role models in front of people. For sponsoring the next generation, being able to have Lynette's story on our podcast, a forum that a lot of young people listen to, is really important. And we've become much more active on social media so we can get the stories out there as well. I think it's just encouraging for me to hear that how a white professor can have that kind of influence. And there's a huge difference we can make. And I think Harvey's completely right about it needing to start young as well. So the more BioLogos is working at the high school level as well, and our new curriculum, we're bringing in a lot of diverse voices into that. Yeah, I also, Claude, at the beginning, you were talking about this moment for our country and how the amniotic fluid of our country is in racism. And I want to give you a chance to finish that thought, because how are you seeing that historical progression and what this moment means today?
Well, I think first of all, to understand that that is what that is. It is in the very DNA, right?
Yeah.
And so, you know, for those who have multiple myeloma, right? The only way that they are cured is for those cancerous cells to be taken out and healthy cells infused. And you almost
Great science metaphor.
right, yeah, yes, and if you talk to any person who goes through that, they literally say, I went through a death to live. Right? I literally felt like I was dying, and this notion of how vulnerable they were, right, to any type of infection, how enclosed, the amount of care that had to happen. And so I think that that is metaphorical in terms of what it requires for us as a nation. It requires a cleansing at the very cellular level. It requires a degree of vulnerability and almost something close to dying in order for us to be healthy as a society. And both science and faith have a role in that, because just I'm using scientific language to help understand it, right? And because this is a matter of spirit, it takes those who know something about spiritual matters to give their voice into that. And so BioLogos is a unique organization at the intersection of both. Yeah. 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 Lynette, you are at Texas A&M.
Yes.
Aggie.
And Aggie. That's right.
Well, I think she would be called a Maggie.
Oh, okay.
I think that's the female version of an Aggie.
Okay. All right. I stand corrected. So in this field of academia, in which you can be viewed as a unicorn of sorts. Talk about the notion of what it means to feel safe in that environment, and how institutions should look at, if we're going to recruit people of color, how do we make them feel safe once they've been recruited?
That is a great topic and a great question. It's honestly, it's very difficult in a lot of circumstances to feel safe walking into these buildings that are predominantly white, and these spaces that are predominantly white, and feeling like what I have to say will be valued and taken seriously, and not feeling like I'm there to be the diversity statistic. And so if we're very serious about retaining Black students and creating Black scientists and Black physicians, then we have to be very serious and intentional about investing in those Black students. And so I think it's going to be really important moving forward that institutions and universities take a very serious look at how they're investing in those students, and making sure that this isn't just an email that goes out that says, we support you, but that this is real change. This is setting up networks for students to succeed, specifically for students of color to succeed. And I think that's going to be really important moving forward, is making sure those students feel valued and safe.
Harvey, as a pastor who has professional people as members, how are you dealing with their feeling unsafe, and what are things that the church does to bolster them, to make them feel safe?
Well, I mean, I think it's part of my responsibility to be, if you will, a caretaker, a shepherd, and so you nurture uh, people from whatever station that they find themselves in. And so uh, individuals who are considering and contemplating taking on some of the more disciplined courses, you want to encourage them. For many years we offered scholarships where we would send young students to Africa and let them spend a month in Africa so that they could learn and work within their fields. I think it's important that ministries and uh, um, buy books, encourage people to go on and not just uh, do their bachelor's, but to go on and do postgraduate work and to be an encouragement of that. Sometimes individuals feel like that they have accomplished something because they got their bachelor's, and you want them to know that there's still some more work to be done, and we need your voice, we need your perspective, and we need you there. You know, Claude, you and I, in fact, when I met Lynette, we were at the BioLogos conference, and what a wonderful opportunity to hear, to learn, to get information, to expand your horizon and your brain. And this last time I was sitting there, and as I was enjoying the moment, I looked around. And as I looked around, we had the biggest crowd that we've ever had, but I could only count four, I think Lynette, yourself, myself, and maybe one other African American or Black person in that group. And I know the work that Deb does. I know what we do. I know how we try to reach out, but it speaks to the difficulty of the problem, and it speaks to what we must do to try to um, integrate and get more people of color into this level of science and religion.
Yeah, indeed. Can I just dwell there a
Sure.
moment?
Yes, absolutely.
I, you talk about the need to feel safe. Did you folks feel safe at our meeting, or we certainly wanted you to feel safe and welcome, and we were very glad to feature your voices. Did you feel safe? And then also, what more can we do? Do you have any practical suggestions or things of how we can do better at bringing in a more diverse audience?
I think you buy Claude some airplane tickets and train tickets. Actually, you know, one of the things of being Black is, and if you have been blessed to achieve in any particular area, you learn how you adapt how to be a minority. You adapt how to be in a room where it will not be an awful lot of people of color. You learn how to survive, and you learn how to find your allies, whether they're white, Black, Hispanic. You learn how to find your allies, and you also know how to spot those who are fictitious and really have some underlying motives and thoughts. But you don't last 400 years by not being able to adapt.
Mhm. Certainly. And just to add to that, I'll definitely say I certainly always felt safe. I didn't always feel comfortable. I remember in the book sale area where that would go on, I remember that I purposely made sure my purse was always showing so that no one would think I was just stealing books. I remember having that very conscious thought. So yeah, like Pastor Harvey said, you learn to adapt.
Yeah, yeah. So Deb, I think what you're hearing is twofold, right? There are things that an organization can do to make people feel safe and comfortable, right? And part of that is seeing people who look like them, both on the stage, within positions of authority within the organization, right? Those are things that the organization can do that make people feel safe and comfortable. But then there are unspoken things, right? That the organization may or may not have control of. You may not control how an exhibitor responds to Lynette, right?
Right.
But because that is within the purview of your event, right? It's then looked at as not just the exhibitor, but BioLogos. And so there is that is at play. I think that what a person of color, if I know your intent, that's very important. The whole notion of intent and motive and consistency. Those are things that I look for. So it's not just the first event, but is it consistent throughout multiple events and interactions, and seeing how intentional you've been in the board of advisors, the board of directors, and in participants. That has gone a long way to making at least me feel safe. Yeah.
Okay.
Bishop, you talked about the fact, that what we suffer from in America is, systemic. It is ingrained. I heard someone the other day say, America is not broke. It was designed like this. It was from its inception. From its inception, it was planned to be. So what we're dealing with is not something that was right and then became wrong, and we now have to fix it. It was wrong from the inception, and because of that, and this is where I'm going with what you said, Bishop, is sometimes you can do what's good as opposed to what's best. And I want to make sure that we don't miss this moment in our nation, or attempt and try to not miss this moment in our nation by breaking the yellow leaves off the shoot, as opposed to looking at the root problem and the root cause. Because if we just go around breaking yellow leaves off the shoot, some more yellow leaves going to come back because you haven't solved the root problem, and you haven't found out what the root cause is. I think if we're going to deal with racism, that it's not just about law enforcement. Racism in economics, racism in education, racism. I mean, it's just across the board. It has to be dealt with, in the heart, in the soul of individuals. And that's why, Bishop, you were talking about the intersection of science and religion. We must make sure that we keep God in the play, because if you do not change a man's heart or a woman's heart, legislation won't do it. And I'm not suggesting by any means that we shouldn't fight for good legislation or shouldn't fight for good laws. That's not my suggestion. But my suggestion is that there's no greater law writer than God. And if you don't keep his law, you don't keep man's law.
Right. You talked about getting at the fundamental level, and it occurs to me that there is a parallel as it relates to law enforcement and science in this regard. For at least 350 years of our 400 years of being in America, the official role of law enforcement was to keep Negroes in place. That was the official role of law enforcement from the time that the sheriff's job was to find the runaway slave and bring that slave back until really in the 1950s. The official role was to keep Negroes in their place. Don't drink at that fountain. Don't sit in that seat. The official role was to keep Negroes in their place. And so it's only been for the past 60 years, roughly, that has had to change. But you don't have 350 years of something and expect it to automatically change across the nation in just that short a period of time. The same could be said about science in some regard, in terms of how the history of science and people of color, in terms of testing. And so this notion of what fundamentally has to change, we're talking about what has to fundamentally change in policing and law enforcement.
Mm-hmm.
What has to fundamentally change in the area of the sciences that moves to people of color flourishing in that way?
Yeah.
I think for that to happen, we have to start valuing the perspectives of people of color. You know, science itself was started by white men, for white men, to address problems about white men. And so now we're moving into this realm where we understand that science was meant to serve societies. And so scientists should be fully representative of the societies that they're serving. And so if we only have one type of perspective in science, we're getting the same sorts of questions asked and we're getting the same sorts of answers. What we need are entirely new perspectives. And we see this all the time. How often does it just take one person to say, why didn't you try this? And you realize that had never occurred to you. Until we need people of color in science asking questions for people of color.
So, Lynette, tell the story you wrote about recently about your perspective on this question of beetles and speciation. You actually had a big insight in that people were missing.
Absolutely. I'll indent it as much as I can. But so 6 years ago, when I started studying this beetle species that all of my dissertation work was on, it was not thought that this species was one species. So there are four or five different color variations of it. And it was actually said that these color variations could not be the same species because they look too different. Well, I'm a biracial person. My mom is Mexican American, my dad is African American, and my sister took after our mom. So she has much lighter skin, much straighter hair, whereas I took after my dad with darker skin and curly hair. And growing up, people would always ask us at restaurants, at movie theaters, anywhere, are y'all sisters? Huh, you don't really, you just don't look alike. You just look so different. And that was my whole perspective growing up. That was my entire childhood. And so when established scientists told me these individual beetles can't be the same species because they look too different, that never occurred to me. I was unhindered by those doubts because it's like, well, you should see my sister and I. Mm-hmm. So that's why differences in perspectives really change the questions that we're willing to ask.
They really do.
Wow, 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 wow. You about to say something, Harvey?
No, I'm just admiring her. I'm just admiring. First of all, any any anybody who would do PhD work studying beetles, you got to admire 'em, you know.
Oh, Pastor Harvey.
So this notion of, I mean, Deb hit on it earlier, and Lynette, you've sort of hit around it. This notion of identity, humanity, and as we are entering, well, we're already into this increasingly rapidly moving technological era with AI and transhumanism and all of that. How do you see your speaking into this and the unique perspective that a person of color may bring into it?
That's a great question. I think, in the same way that the history that Black people have had in terms of medicine and science, and like Pastor Harvey mentioned earlier, how we have been the experiment and not the experimenters. I think in that same way, looking forward in order to protect people of color and communities of color, we have to make sure that in those same sorts of experiments, in sort of moving forward with technology, that Black voices are involved to sort of avoid some of the very real tragedies that have happened in the past with using Black people to experiment on. And so I think moving forward with technology, we have to make sure that Black voices are involved for the protection of those same Black voices.
President Kennedy stood and said, in 10 years, let's put a man on the moon. And it was done. Currently, we are working to send humans to Mars, and we are on a good track to be able to do it. We've placed the Hubble telescope out into the distant yonder to discover planets and stars and places that we didn't even know exist. I am and will never be convinced that if we put our hearts and our minds to wanting to solve this problem of racism, it is within the human capacity to be able to do so. It was in our capacity when we were created. God made us and then brought all of the animals before us, before man, and then told him to name them. That's a lot of intellectual capacity to be able to name every animal. The only reason why this problem is prevalent in the United States and even the world, I might add, is because we don't want to. If we wanted to solve the problem, we would come up with a strategy, a plan. As great as this conversation has been tonight, it has been more about rehearsing the problem as opposed to discussing the solution. Yeah. And that's where I think we ought to put our focus and our attention, is how do we use the great brilliant minds and the intellectual wealth that is part of BioLogos and our connections to say that we are going to solve this problem, if for nothing else, in science, in the sphere of influence that BioLogos have. And you gotta have somebody who's charged with that.
That is an amazing call to action, Harvey. I love it. I think it's to accomplish that, we're going to have to think about structural changes, people changes. We're going to have to make sure we're addressing the topics that are most important going forward. We're going to need to improve representation, but not in a just a token way, but in a way that really draws in the voices that we need to be hearing. What kinds of specifics come to your guys' mind, or do you think about what BioLogos could do in this? Like, what would be the most important steps for us to take?
Well, I don't want to hog the time, but I would go back again to what I said earlier. You know, uh, we did a study on education in the feeder patterns of our community. And what we discovered is that a lot of 3 to 4 or 5-year-olds, before they were going to kindergarten, were being kept by Mimi, Aunt Bessie,
Mm.
whomever, because the parents could not afford the to put them in daycare. And if they put them in a daycare, there was a daycare that was not giving them any training, any teaching. It was just babysitting. What we know is that if you come into kindergarten and you cannot at least write your ABCs, count to 100, spell your name, you're already behind. And if you're behind in kindergarten and you will fail, get slower in elementary, you'll become a problem in middle school, and you'll drop out in high school, and you're on your way to penitentiary. So if we're going to solve this problem has to be solved by us knowing that we will not see the result. Most of the stuff that I'm working on now is not for me. It's for generations that are past and beyond me. This work that we must do, we must start early on working with those young kids, poor kids, African Americans, Hispanics, at the early age, and shepherding them all the way through the system and beyond.
Yeah.
Lynette?
Yeah, I mean, just sort of going off of what Pastor Harvey was saying is parents care about their children, and this is no different across any sort of racial community. And so it's definitely going to involve an investment in those children and in the education of those children. And like Pastor said, starting from very young. So I didn't know that I could be a scientist until I was 20 or 21. So my entire career was very much led by God and by the fact that I had a very mother who let me go outside and play with beetles all the time. And so we really have to start showing kids that they have options outside of athletics and the music industry.
Mm.
Deb, I think that one it's saying, okay, as you said, there must be a pivot, and that requires, one, first of all, a commitment, right? Second, it requires a level of courage, because anytime a legacy organization decides it's going to do something with and add a race lens to it, there are some people who become upset and pull their dollars, right? Because they didn't sign up for that, okay? And so for BioLogos or any other organization that says this is something we're going to take seriously, there has to be the courage to recognize that, right? And move forward. I think that you spoke about all of the various levels, right? Where BioLogos can be impactful. what Harvey and Lynette have spoken to is maybe, and this is a programmatic thing, besides the homeschooling school population, how do we engage public schools?
Mm.
Uh, and
Yeah.
those children, and make them aware of these scientists, these astrophysicists, these
Mhm.
you name it, right? How do
Mhm.
we do that? Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
That's a really good point of the public school population. And, a lot of our work at BioLogos has been to work with the conservative evangelical church on science issues. And, and so part of that, but that misses out on serving the kinds of needs we're talking about tonight. And so to bring our work into a more public school context is a great way that we could go. So we have heard some resistance from just the few things we put out in the last couple of weeks on social media, as much resistance as we got when we started talking about climate change. All of a sudden, people talking back on social media, and so we are starting to see that this is a big deal. And I know we have spent quite a bit of time here rehearsing the problems of the past, but there's still stuff a lot of people haven't heard. A lot of white people are simply unaware. It's like there's a conspiracy of silence, of things we are never told, just never aware of, completely shielded from, and never have to address, have the luxury of ignoring. So since a lot of what we do at BioLogos is raising awareness and helping people broach new challenging topics, that also is an important role for us to help people be exposed to things if they have not heard, so that they too can become allies in this, to see what the problems are and begin to see ways they can be a part of the solution.
I think that is, again, if you focus and you want to change something, you will.
Yeah.
And I'm not, Deb, please, I know how hard you staff work. I know what your intentions are. I've sat in meetings, where we've had these discussions, and so this is not a critique or criticism.
Yeah.
It's a challenge. It's a challenge because if I'm affiliated with BioLogos, so that means that I fail too. I'm not putting it off on just the white community. I think we've all failed, but it's a long-term strategy. It is
Yeah.
not something that will be changed overnight. It's not something that Bishop is right. You are going to be met with resistance.
Mm-hmm.
But anything worth having and that is important, you accept that challenge and you move on.
Yeah.
Let me say this. I think the scientific community as well as the faith community share the same problem. And these recent events, as we dealt with COVID-19, is illuminated more so than ever. It is
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
it is that the powers that be want to use the scientific community as well as the religious community to manipulate people as opposed to listen at the facts. They when when the doctor was giving the information and saying we cannot do this, this will spread the disease. We don't want to hear that. What we want to hear is tell us what we want. Pastors have the same problem. People come to us and they want us, and when we start talking about God and talking about a relationship as opposed to religion, they don't want to hear that. Just help me to get the congregation over to this place, to stop doing that. They don't want the bulk and the meat and the essence of what we do. We are disciplined in our scholarship. The text is what the text is. I can't make it be something other than what it is. You go in the laboratory, you're doing the work in the laboratory, and either it produces or it doesn't. But both of us have the same challenge, is trying to modify human behavior.
Yeah, that is the real challenge. Modify changing hearts as well as minds. It's a huge challenge.
If you change the heart, the mind will change.
So as we're living in this COVID-19 era, Lynette, from your perspective, what have been lessons learned and things we need to be focusing on?
That's a great question. I think one of the things that has come out of this pandemic is that it's really been brought to our attention that the things that happen in this country do not affect all communities equally. And so communities who have had a lack of access to clean drinking water have had a much harder time in dealing with this pandemic, where washing your hands is one of the main ways to kill this virus. And one of the biggest correlates to access to clean water is race. And so I think this has made us realize that racial inequality and racial injustices are also climate injustices. And so communities of color will feel the greatest impacts when it comes to food insecurity, water inequality, and the transmission of diseases. And that we have to start investing in those communities and investing in the safety and the health of those communities.
Harvey, how about you?
There is a doctor here at Baylor University who's over their tropical disease work. What we found in many of our communities is that while we may be, a leading country, is that when you're poor, you can have third world diseases in your community. In other words, you can be living in the heart of Houston, in the heart of Chicago, in the heart of Los Angeles. You can be living in third world conditions. And if you're living in third world conditions, you'll have third world diseases. And the strange thing about it is that when parents take their children to the doctor, if the doctor is not familiar with the type of tropical diseases that these individuals has, is that they're misdiagnosed. If a child is suffering from lead poisoning and they all up running all over the classroom and acting strange or can't learn, it's not because they have some kind of mental, emotional problem. They are poisoned and intoxicated by their environment. And often misdiagnosed by the physicians that they're going to see, because if those physicians are not reading the latest journals and getting the latest information, they'll misdiagnose that. That's happening right before our very eyes in all over the country. And by the way, if it's happening and it's happening at these young ages, then you compound that with them not getting the right amount of education at 0 to 6 to 7 to 8 years old, and then being misdiagnosed, and then stigmatized by saying that they have some kind of emotional and mental anxieties that they're dealing with. So now they set on the curve and they begin to respond and act like folks say that they are when they really are not. You know, we need the academy, but what I'm talking to you about now is from a practitioner.
Right.
Right. Right. Deb, what about you?
Oh, for how this pandemic has had such racial disparities in its impact. It was so grievous to see, that things where things had been very bad with poor access to water or just marginally worse, and then suddenly seeing that people are dying at such higher rates among communities of color because of all these compounding factors. I guess the redemption in it can be if this does move our systems, our healthcare systems, our government systems to have better access to healthcare, to have more trustworthy healthcare, to have clean water, and those things. I hope it is a motivating factor. I'm a little bit proud of Michigan because Michigan was one of the first to report the COVID deaths by race, and we had our first big outbreak in Detroit, and so it was sad to see, but at least it helped raise awareness for the issue. Yeah.
So we've had a discussion that has sought to bring one awareness to our viewers in terms of the history, because there are contemporary implications from it. And I want to tie the bow. In Charlotte, North Carolina, when you look at, we have two major highways, Highway 85 and Highway 77. Both of those were cut through intact African American neighborhoods. They just divided them. They just split them. If you look at where waste treatment, sanitation, where the airport, all these disruptors to community life were in minority neighborhoods. So when we look at water, when we look at what is emitted in the environment, in those neighborhoods, that what we currently see is because of what is historical, right? Mm-hmm. And so that is really the connection between history and present day. And if we don't know the history, we will not understand the present day and know how to solve it. Wow, it is now 9:15 and they are telling me we've got to wrap it up, and we just got started. Oh my gosh. Wow. So here's how we're going to end up. Deb, we're going to start with you. Any last words? Lynette, any last words? And then Harvey, you got the last word, and you'll close us out with prayer.
Thank you, Bishop.
Wonderful.
All right.
Okay, this has been great, and I agree, the time's gone fast. I feel like there's so much more we could talk about. I want everyone to know this is not our last word on this by any means. We do plan to have more events, listen for episodes of our podcast. We've been brainstorming lots of great names of scientists or African Americans and people of faith who have great stories to tell. And we'd love to hear from our viewers as well, your ideas of how BioLogos can be part of the solution. And things we can do. So we're going to keep growing in this. And we are committed to keep growing in this for the long term.
The last thing I'll say is that this absolutely has to be an all hands on deck movement. I mentioned earlier, I was one of 2 to 5 Black people in my department at any given time. If we are relying on those people to do all of the outreach, all of the teaching, as well as the same amount of work that their white colleagues are doing, we will not have Black scientists or Black physicians. It won't happen. Mm-hmm. So this includes all of us intentionally investing in Black voices.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I would, first of all, Claude, thank you for moderating and leading us through this through this process. Great job. So glad you were able to get your
Yes.
technology together. Yeah, it wouldn't have been the same without you. Deb, I appreciate you and BioLogos staff and board for having the vision, the inclination to want to have this discussion, because clearly you could have hid under the shroud of science and not even attempt to have this conversation. And so you and the staff are to be applauded for the work that you're doing. Let's continue on in this work, and let's change the moment. I want to say to my friend, congratulations on your PhD. I'm so excited. I can't wait to have a discussion again with you about beetles. With that, my final word is to all of us, is because this is systemic and because it is so ingrained within our DNA and our nation, it's going to require all of us to become a committee of one uh, in our circles of influence, where and all of us have relatives and friends and buddies that will say things on the playground, in the at the country club, um, in the private settings around the dinner table, that we don't believe in, but they'll say it because they think that they can get away with it because of anonymity. We must become a committee of one, and we must fight that at that level. We must say that we don't agree, and we must confront it, and we must educate ourselves on voting, and we must vote for those who represent what it is that we believe and what it is that we're fighting for. And finally, the most important thing is to know that there are some things that are beyond human capacity, human ability. And that's the good news, is that we have a creator who loves us, who cares for us, who has not forsaken us, nor have forgotten us. And so let us now confront the one who created us. Most holy and righteous and wonderful God, the creator of the universe and the ruler of the cosmos, the giver of every good and perfect gift, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the one who is not so selfish, but gave us his only begotten Son, that we might have the gift of eternal life. We are grateful, God. We're grateful. We're grateful to you. We're grateful, Father, that you have given us the opportunity to be part of the solution as opposed to the problem. We pray for wisdom. We pray for knowledge and understanding. We pray for discipline and courage. We ask, my God, that you would bless Deb and the BioLogos staff, that you would guide them and those of us who are advisors in this effort. We pray for those who have been injured by our carelessness. We pray for those who are the perpetrators of hatred, that enlightenment would take place. And finally, God, finally, my Father, on that day when everyone will know that thou art God, give us a place just anywhere in your kingdom. And let us hear you say unto us, servants, well done. This, God, is our prayer, each in our own way, but many of us in the name of Jesus the Christ. Amen and amen. Thank y'all.
Amen.
Thank you all so
Amen.
much.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Deb.
Yes. Thank you all so much
All
for being
right.
here with us tonight.